The gathering grand banquet hall sparkled like a palace. Chandeliers hung high above, spilling golden light that danced across crystal glasses and polished silver plates. Long tables stretched across the hall, covered in white silk cloth and decorated with flowers that smelled sweet and fresh. Soft music from a grand piano floated through the air, blending with the laughter and loud voices of the wealthy guests. Men in sharp suits and women in glittering gowns sat proudly, their fingers heavy with rings, their necks shining with diamonds. These were the billionaires, the powerful people who owned companies, land, and ships. They spoke with big voices, full of confidence, as if the whole world belonged to them. At the edge of this shining world moved Daniel, a young black waiter. His uniform was clean, but simple. The collar of his shirt was a little tight, and his black shoes had been polished so many times that almost looked new. Daniel carried a silver tray in his hands, balancing glasses of wine with quiet skill. He walked carefully, never rushing, his eyes lowered just enough to show respect. Most of the guests did not notice him. To them, he was invisible, just another servant moving in the background. But Daniel saw everything. He saw the proud tilt of their chins, the way they laughed too loudly at their own jokes, the way they ignored the soft music that was meant to calm the room. He listened, too. He heard their voices that carried stories of power, money, and control. Some spoke of their businesses, others bragged about their travels. But Daniel also heard the arrogance that dripped like poison between their words. One man sat at the center of attention, Mr. Chen, a billionaire from China, wore a dark suit with a golden tie. His watch alone was worth more than Daniel could ever earn in a lifetime. He leaned back in his chair, laughing with his mouth wide open, showing teeth that had been carefully polished like ivory. The people around him laughed too, even when his jokes were not funny. Chen enjoyed this attention. His voice was smooth, his words quick, and when he grew bored of talking about himself, he turned his sharp eyes toward Daniel, who was standing nearby, waiting quietly to serve. Mr. Chen's lips curled into a smile that was not kind. He spoke in Mandarin, a language Daniel recognized, but had never been asked to use here. His words carried across the table, low but clear enough for the wealthy guests sitting close to him. This one, Mr. Chen said in Mandarin, nodding toward Daniel. Look at how he bows his head, a man born to serve. His place is at our feet. The table erupted in laughter. The men chuckled. The women covered their mouths as they giggled, and the sound rolled through the golden hall like a cruel wave. Glasses clinked as some raised them, enjoying the joke. Daniel stood still. His tray was steady, though his heart was not. Inside him, something burned, a fire that grew hotter with each burst of laughter. His ears caught every word. His memory, sharp as glass. He understood perfectly what had been said, though none of the rich guests imagined he could. He swallowed the heat rising in his chest. His mother's voice echoed in his mind, soft but strong. Never let them steal your dignity. Keep your head high, even when they try to push you down. He breathed slowly, calming the storm inside. His eyes lowered again, but this time not out of weakness. He was thinking, watching, waiting. The laughter at the table grew louder. Another man added something to the joke, also in Mandarin. He waved his hand toward Daniel like one would wave away a stray dog. More laughter followed, cruel and careless. The pianist's fingers paused for a moment, as if even the music could feel the shame in the air. But the guests did not notice. Their laughter was all they heard. Daniel's face remained calm, but his heart was heavy. He thought of his long journey, of the nights he had studied under dim light, teaching himself languages from old books and borrowed tapes. He remembered the pride he felt when he first spoke Mandarin fluently, surprising even his teacher. To him, language was not just words. It was power. It was connection. It was respect. And here, in this golden hall, that power sat quietly in his chest, waiting. He shifted his tray slightly, his strong hands steady as ever. His eyes lifted for the first time, just a little, catching the sharp gaze of Mr. Chen. Their eyes met for only a second, but it was enough. Daniel saw arrogance in those eyes, but he also saw something else, a weakness hidden beneath pride. The hall glowed around them, full of jewels, gold, and laughter. But between Daniel and Mr. Chen, there was now a silent line, a quiet challenge that no one else could yet see. Daniel took a step forward, his heart beating like a drum. He knew the night was not finished. Something was about to change. The laughter around him felt distant now. The golden light seemed brighter, And though no one noticed yet, the waiter was no longer invisible, not to himself, not to the billionaire who mocked him. The gathering had begun, but the true story was only just unfolding. The mocker's laughter in the banquet hall did not die quickly. It rolled like thunder, bouncing from table to table, feeding the pride of the men who thought themselves untouchable. Guests leaned closer to one another, whispering and pointing at Daniel as though he were part of a show, not a man carrying dignity inside him. Daniel stood still, tray balanced perfectly on his strong arms. His dark eyes looked calm, yet inside, his thoughts moved like rushing water. He was not new to mockery. He had lived through it many times, in many forms. But something about this moment was heavier. The golden lights, the glittering jewelry, the arrogance that filled the room, it all made the insult burn deeper. Chen was not finished. He leaned back in his chair, sipping his wine with slow confidence. Then he spoke again in Mandarin, his voice sharp, like a blade drawn to cut. "Look at him," he said to the others, nodding toward Daniel. "He does not even understand our words. He only knows how to stand there, quiet, like a shadow. He serves, but he will never rise. Men like him are born to stay low." The words dripped with cruelty. Some of the guests chuckled again, softer now, but enough to wound. Others hid their smiles behind their glasses, not wanting to seem too bold, but still enjoying the humiliation. Daniel understood every word. Each syllable struck him like a stone, but he did not flinch. His chest rose and fell in a steady rhythm. His silence was not weakness, it was patience. His lips pressed together, holding back the reply that stirred within him. He remembered his mother's face, the lines of struggle carved into her cheeks, the strength in her eyes. She had once told him, "The world will test you. They will laugh, but do not bow to their laughter. Your silence is a shield, but your words, when spoken at the right time, can become a sword." Mr. Chen smirked, misreading Daniel's silence as fear. "See," he said in English this time, his voice loud so everyone could hear. "He does not even look me in the eye. He knows his place." A ripple of agreement moved across the table. Some nodded, others laughed politely, and a few clapped their hands softly on the table as if applauding the cruelty. Daniel lowered his tray, carefully setting it down on a nearby stand. The movement was small, but it drew quiet attention from those closest. His posture shifted slightly, his shoulders straighter, his chin just a little higher. The air seemed to change, though most guests did not yet understand why. He stepped forward slowly, his polished shoes making almost no sound on the marble floor. His eyes, deep and calm, lifted to meet Mr. Chen's gaze. For the first time, Daniel looked directly at the man who mocked him. The silence stretched thin, like a rope pulled tight. Some guests noticed the shift and hushed their voices. Even the pianist slowed his playing, his fingers hovering above the keys as if he felt the storm about to come. Chen frowned. "What is this?" he asked sharply, annoyance flashing in his tone. "Do you dare to look at me like that?" Daniel's lips parted, but he did not speak yet. He breathed in, slow and steady, his voice preparing itself like a bow drawn before releasing an arrow. His heart pounded, but it was not from fear, it was from the weight of truth he carried inside. The guests leaned forward now, curious. They expected Daniel to apologize, to beg, to explain himself. That was how such scenes usually ended. But the way Daniel stood tall, unmoving, with a quiet strength, made some wonder if something else was about to unfold. One woman at the table whispered to her husband, "Look at his eyes. He is not afraid." Mr. Chen's smirk returned. "Well," he asked, his words dripping with arrogance, "have you forgotten your place already?" Daniel finally spoke. His voice was soft, but clear, like water flowing over smooth stones. And when he spoke, it was not in English, it was in perfect Mandarin. The words slid from his tongue with elegance, each tone precise, each syllable sharp. His voice carried across the hall, breaking the heavy air. "Respect is not measured by wealth. It is measured by how you treat others." The room froze. The laughter died instantly, cut short like a candle blown out by the wind. Glasses paused midair, forks stopped in half bites, eyes widened in disbelief. Even the music stopped completely as the pianist's hands fell still. His mouth slightly opened in shock. Gasps filled the room. Some covered their mouths, others leaned closer, asking in whispers, "Did you hear?" He spoke Mandarin. Daniel stood steady, his dark eyes locked on Mr. Chen. There was no anger in them, only truth. His voice had been calm, but its weight was heavy enough to crush arrogance. Dahmer. Chen's face drained of color. His smirk faltered. He blinked quickly, as though his mind could not accept what he had just heard. The man he had mocked, the man he had called a servant, without understanding, had spoken back to him, in his own tongue, not broken, not clumsy, perfect. The silence in the hall was louder than the laughter that had filled it moments ago, and in that silence, Daniel's dignity stood taller than every jewel, every chandelier, and every dollar of wealth in the room. The mockery was over, but the real story had just begun. The silence before the storm hall that had once echoed with laughter now sat in heavy silence. It was the kind of silence that pressed down on the chest, the kind that made every breath feel louder than it should be. Guests stared wide-eyed, their jeweled fingers frozen mid-air, their wine glasses trembling in hands that had grown suddenly unsteady. Daniel stood in the center of it all, not with the posture of a servant, but with the quiet dignity of a man who knew his worth. The golden lights from the chandeliers seemed to catch on his dark skin, painting him in a soft glow. He had not raised his voice. He had not shouted, yet his words had struck the entire room like lightning. The billionaire who had mocked him, Mr. Chen, sat stiffly in his chair, the smirk that once curled on his lips wiped clean. His eyes blinked rapidly, as though trying to make sense of the impossible. For a moment, he looked small, stripped of the power his money usually carried like armor. Around the table, whispers began to stir. Did you hear that? His Mandarin, it was flawless. Not a single mistake, perfect tones. The guests who had once laughed now glanced nervously at each other. Some shifted in their seats, their arrogance cooling into shame. A few even lowered their eyes, embarrassed by their earlier laughter. Daniel's chest rose and fell steadily, though inside his heart pounded like a drum. He had spoken, and he knew there was no going back. His mother's words came to him again. Your silence can shield you, but your words, when spoken with truth, will shake mountains. And now, he could feel the mountain trembling. The pianist, sensing the weight of the moment, let his fingers rest quietly on the keys. Even the music dared not disturb the storm that hovered in the room. The only sound was the soft clink of ice melting in glasses, the shallow breaths of men and women who suddenly realized they were witnessing something unforgettable. Dahmer. Chen finally found his voice. You speak Mandarin? His tone cracked, breaking the mask of arrogance he had worn so easily before. Daniel's eyes did not leave him. Calm, steady, firm. Yes, he answered softly, his Mandarin as clear as glass. And I understand every word you have said about me tonight. Gasps rippled across the hall. Some covered their mouths in shock. A woman at the far end of the table whispered every word, as though it were impossible to believe. Dahmer. Chen shifted in his seat, his golden tie now feeling like a rope round his neck. His face flushed, a mix of anger and shame. You dare to speak to me like this? He demanded, but his voice lacked its usual strength. The weight of the room pressed against him, and for the first time, he felt the eyes of others not as admiration but as judgment. Daniel took a slow step forward, his polished shoes gliding silently across the marble floor. The tray he had once carried was forgotten on the stand, for he carried something heavier now. Truth. He spoke again, his words calm but unyielding. In every language, respect is the same. It is not earned by money, it is shown by kindness. His voice carried across the hall, steady and unwavering, each word like a stone dropping into still water, sending ripples through every heart present. A pause followed, a long pause. No one moved, no one dared to laugh now. Then something unexpected happened. At another table, an older man, a billionaire with silver hair and soft eyes, rose slowly to his feet. He placed his napkin gently on the table and nodded once at Daniel. The young man is right, he said in English, his voice deep and commanding. Respect is the greatest wealth any of us can carry. The room shifted again. The silence cracked as murmurs spread like fire. Heads turned, eyes widened, and suddenly the air was no longer heavy with arrogance, but with awakening. A few hands clapped, soft at first, cautious, then more joined, until the sound of applause filled the hall. Some guests stood, others nodded, in agreement, and the hall that had once mocked Daniel now celebrated the strength of his voice. Daniel bowed his head slightly, not in submission, but in gratitude. His eyes shone with quiet pride, though his face remained calm. He had not spoken to humiliate anyone. He had spoken to remind them, but not everyone was ready to accept it. Mr. Chen's fist clenched tightly on the arms of his chair, His face was red with humiliation, his pride wounded deeper than any sword could cut. He looked around, seeing his supporters vanish like smoke. Their laughter was gone, their loyalty fading, replaced by admiration for the very man he had mocked. Daniel turned to him one last time, his voice softer now, but still in Mandarin. "You thought I was invisible, but dignity does not disappear, even when ignored. It lives here," he said, placing a hand gently on his chest. And then he stepped back, the storm in his heart finally calming, leaving behind only the quiet strength of a man who had stood his ground. The hall remained hushed, broken only by the continued applause of those who now saw him not as a waiter, but as a man of honor. The silence before the storm had ended, and in its place, a new storm was brewing, one that would forever change the memory of this golden night. The hall erupts for a few heartbeats. The banquet hall stood still, as though time itself had stopped. The chandelier still glowed, the piano still sat open, but all eyes were on the young waiter who had spoken words that none expected. His Mandarin, clear and perfect, still echoed in the minds of those who heard it. Then, like the sudden crash of a wave, the silence broke. Gasps rose first sharp, quick, uncertain. Then came the murmurs, whispered voices bouncing from table to table. "Did you hear him? He spoke as if you were one of us. No better." His tones were flawless. The sound grew louder, spreading like fire in dry grass. The proud laughter that had once filled the room was gone, replaced by the restless buzz of curiosity and disbelief. At one corner of the hall, a man in a silver suit began clapping, his hands slow but firm. A woman near him joined, and then another guest followed. Soon, applause spread through the hall. Not polite, but genuine, thunderous, strong, impossible to ignore. Daniel did not move. He stood straight, his face calm, his eyes steady. Inside, his heart pounded hard, but his spirit was calm. The applause was not what he wanted. He had not spoken to be praised. He had spoken because truth had demanded his voice. Chen, however, felt the room slipping from his control. His fingers gripped the edge of the table tightly, his face burned red, a mixture of shame and rage. He rose halfway from his chair, his voice shaking as he barked, "Enough," but no one listened. The applause continued, rolling through the golden hall like thunder. Some guests stood from their chairs, their jewelry catching the light as they clapped with pride. Others leaned forward, eyes glowing with admiration, whispering words of respect toward Daniel, the billionaire who had earlier supported kindness. The one with silver hair raised his voice above the noise. "Young man," he said, gesturing toward Daniel, "you have reminded us tonight that honor does not wear a suit, and dignity does not sit only at this table. Sometimes truth stands among us in the uniform." The hall roared again with applause. Daniel bowed his head slightly, accepting their words with humility. His eyes swept the room and landed back on Mr. Chen, who now stood frozen, trembling with anger. "You think yourself clever," Mr. Chen spat in English, his voice loud and sharp. "Do you believe a few words in my language make you my equal?" The words struck the air, but they did not strike Daniel. The young waiter lifted his chin, his dark eyes glowing under the golden lights. He spoke again in Mandarin, his tone steady and respectful, yet unbreakable. "Words do not make us equal. Humanity does. And tonight, it is not wealth that shines brightest, it is truth." The crowd gasped again, but this time there was no shock of disbelief. There was admiration, deep and undeniable. Chen's face contorted, but the room no longer belonged to him. He had lost his power, not by force, but by the weight of a waiter's dignity. One by one, guests turned away from Mr. Chen. Their smiles, once painted for his amusement, now faced Daniel. Some whispered apologies to themselves for laughing earlier. Others looked ashamed, unable to meet Daniel's gaze. The piano player, sensing the moment, touched the keys softly, filling the air with a slow, graceful tune that carried peace instead of arrogance. The golden hall, once filled with cruelty, now pulsed with something different. Respect. Daniel stood silently, letting the music wash over the room. His heart, though heavy with what had happened, felt lighter now. He had spoken not just for himself, but for every invisible worker, every quiet soul who had been mocked, ignored, or belittled. A young woman in a blue dress, sitting near the front, wiped a tear from her eye. She whispered, "He's braver than all of them." Her words echoed what many now felt. Chen lowered himself back into his chair, defeated. His hands shook as he grabbed his wine glass, but when he raised it to his lips, the taste was bitter, poisoned by humiliation. No wealth could save him from the truth spoken by a man he had thought. Beneath him, the applause finally softened, but the energy in the hall remained alive. Like sparks waiting to catch flame again, Daniel stepped back, placing his hands calmly behind him. He was still a waiter in uniform, but to the people around him, he had become something more. The golden hall no longer looked at him as invisible. They looked at him as a man who had carried the weight of silence and then broken it with courage. And though the night was far from over, one thing was already clear: the story of this evening would be told again and again, long after the candles burned out and the chandeliers dimmed out, because on this night, in a hall of power and pride, the one voice that truly mattered came not from wealth, but from truth spoken in the tongue of the arrogant, turned against them with dignity. The hall had erupted, and in that eruption, something greater than laughter had been born. The change. In the air, the applause in the golden hall slowly faded, but its echo remained heavy, like the after sound of thunder rolling through the mountains. For a moment, everyone simply sat in silence, their hearts adjusting to the weight of what they had witnessed. Daniel stood tall, not boasting, not smiling. His face carried calm dignity, as though speaking truth was not an act of pride, but an act of necessity. His hands were folded neatly in front of him, his posture steady. He looked like a man unshaken, though inside, his heart still pulsed with the storm of what had just happened. The air itself seemed to have changed. Where arrogance had once filled the hall like smoke, there was now something new: respect, curiosity, and even guilt. Some of the guests lowered their eyes to the table, ashamed of their laughter from earlier. A few turned to glance at Mr. Chen, whose proud figure now sat in silence, his face pale and drawn tight with humiliation. For the first time, the billionaire looked small. The older man with silver hair, who had stood earlier to defend Daniel, rose again. His chair scraped softly against the polished marble floor. When he spoke, his voice carried authority, the kind that demanded attention without shouting. "This young man," he said, gesturing to Daniel, "has shown us tonight that true worth cannot be measured in coins, titles, or jewels. We were blinded by our pride, and he, a waiter, opened our eyes with nothing more than honesty and courage." The hall listened in silence, the chandeliers casting golden shadows across thoughtful faces. Another guest, a woman in emerald silk, nodded in agreement. She lifted her glass and said softly, "Yes, tonight, I feel humble." Others murmured their agreement. Some even raised their glasses toward Daniel in a silent toast. The hall, once united in cruel laughter, now bent toward respect, but not. All were ready to embrace the change. Chen's hand slammed suddenly on the table, the sound sharp and startling. He rose from his chair, his eyes blazing with anger, his pride refusing to accept defeat. "You applaud a servant," he spat. "You raise your glasses to a man who carries your plates." The room stiffened. Some guests froze in discomfort, others whispered nervously. The tension that had just softened returned sharply, like the sting of cold wind after warmth. Mr. Chen pointed a trembling finger at Daniel. "He is nothing. His place is here, beneath us, serving quietly. Do not let a few clever words fool you." Daniel did not flinch. He took a quiet breath, his chest rising, his eyes never leaving the billionaires. Then, in perfect Mandarin, his voice calm but unshakable, he answered, "Titles do not define greatness. Money cannot silence truth. Even a servant has a voice, and tonight, you heard it." His words struck the hall like a bell, clear, resonant, impossible to ignore. Chen faltered, his face turning red once more. He looked around for support, but found none. The very guests who had once laughed at Daniel now looked at Mr. Chen with disapproval. Their eyes, cold and sharp, no longer admired him. His arrogance had turned against him, and Daniel's dignity had exposed it for what it was. One man near the back stood slowly, clapping his hands with a firm rhythm. Others joined him, and once again, the hall filled with applause, not scattered, not uncertain, but united. The sound rolled through the air like a river breaking free from stone. This time, the applause was not just for Daniel's language, but for his courage, for the truth he had spoken, for the humility he carried even as the hall lifted him high. Daniel bowed his head slightly, his voice soft as he said, "I only spoke what needed to be said." The applause grew louder, echoing against the high ceilings. Mr. Chen sank slowly back into his chair, defeated. His golden tie felt heavy around his neck, his hands cold despite the warmth of the room. For the first time in years, he was not the center of power, not the man everyone looked toward. That place now belonged to the very person he had mocked. The hall had changed. The golden light seemed brighter now, the air lighter, the music softer but more beautiful when the pianist began to play again. Guests who had once looked only at their wealth now looked inward. Reminded of the humility they had lost somewhere along the way, a woman whispered to her husband, "We came for a banquet, but we leave with a lesson." Her words carried truth. Daniel stepped back, quietly returning to his place near the side of the hall. He did not bask in the applause. He did not raise his chin in arrogance. He stood as he had before, a waiter in a simple uniform, but no one could look at him the same way. Again, the air had shifted permanently, respect had been restored. Pride had been broken, and though Mr. Chen sat fuming in silence, the rest of the hall knew the truth. The wealthiest man in the room that night was not the billionaire with gold on his wrist, but the young waiter who carried dignity in his heart. The last worth golden banquet hall glowed as though nothing had changed. The chandeliers still glittered, the flowers still filled the air with their perfume, and the piano still played its gentle notes, yet everyone knew the room was not the same. Something deeper had shifted. The night that began with arrogance and laughter now carried weight, memory, and truth. Daniel stood near the side of the room, silent once more, but no longer invisible. Every eye that looked at him carried a different expression, some with guilt, some with respect, and some with quiet admiration. The applause had faded, but the echo of his words still lived in the air, stronger than music, stronger than wealth. Dahmer. Chen sat hunched in his chair, his fists tight, his jaw clenched. His golden tie hung crooked now, his face pale with humiliation. A man who once filled every room with arrogance now found himself small, a shadow beneath the weight of his own pride. He looked around desperately, hoping for support, for even one nod of agreement, but the other billionaires avoided his eyes. They would not stand beside him now. Daniel watched calmly. He did not smirk. He did not boast. He simply stood, waiting, his presence itself louder than any insult could be. At last, Mr. Chen rose again, though his movements were heavy. He straightened his suit, forcing his shoulders back, trying to regain the dignity he had lost. His voice, however, betrayed him. It shook, no longer smooth, no longer strong. "You think yourself wise?" he asked Daniel bitterly. "Do you think the world will change because of your words? Tonight, perhaps they clap for you, but tomorrow, you will still be a waiter, and I will still be a billionaire." The words hung heavy, but they did not carry the power he wanted. Some guests shifted uncomfortably at his cruelty. Others shook their heads slightly, disappointed that even after being humbled, he had not learned. Daniel stepped forward slowly, the soft tap of his polished shoes echoing in the hall. He stopped just a few paces from Mr. Chen, his eyes steady, his voice calm. When he spoke, he did not raise his tone, yet every ear in the hall bent toward him, eager to hear his words. In Mandarin, he answered, his voice clear as water, "Tomorrow, yes, I will still be a waiter, and you will still be rich. But wealth without humility is emptiness, and a man without respect, even if he sits on gold, is still poor." Gasps spread through the room. The words were simple, but they struck like a hammer. Chen's face hardened, but no reply came. His mouth opened, then closed again for the first time. He had no words. Daniel bowed slightly, his respect intact even as he spoke truth. Then, in English, he added softly for all to hear, "I do not need riches to stand tall. My dignity is my crown." The room fell into silence again, but it was not the silence of shock this time. It was the silence of recognition, a silence heavy with respect. One by one, the guests stood, not for Mr. Chen, but for Daniel. Chairs scraped back, gowns rustled, jewels glittered as people rose to their feet. Some clapped again, slower now, not with the excitement of surprise, but with the depth of reverence. Others simply bowed their heads in acknowledgement. The silver-haired man who had spoken earlier placed his hand over his heart and said, "Young man, you will not be remembered as a waiter tonight. You will be remembered as the teacher who reminded you of what wealth truly means." Daniel lowered his gaze humbly. "I only spoke what needed to be spoken," he replied quietly. The piano's soft notes swelled again. filling the golden hall with a music that felt different now, less like background and more like a hymn. Dotmer, Chen sank back into his chair, defeated, isolated, the wealth on his wrist, the jewels in his cufflinks, the power in his name. None of it mattered in this moment. He had lost what Daniel had gained, respect. Daniel turned, walking calmly back toward his duties. He lifted the tray once more, carrying it with the same steady balance as always. Yet now, as he moved between the tables, the guests no longer saw him as invisible. They watched him with quiet admiration, their conversations hushed, their hearts stirred. For the rest of the evening, no one dared to mock. The laughter that returned was softer, kinder. The hall was still filled with wealth, but his pride had been humbled by truth. When the last candle burned low and the night came to an end, every guest left with a story that would outlive their banquets and riches. They would remember the young waiter who spoke in the billionaire's own tongue, who broke arrogance with dignity, and who reminded the powerful that humanity itself is the highest treasure. And as Daniel stepped out into the cool night air after his shift, the stars above seemed brighter, as though they'd have listened, as though they'd honored the quiet courage of a man who spoke when it mattered most. The last word had been spoken, and it did not belong to wealth. It belonged to truth.